This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Kia ora koutou, you are listening to Left From Nowhere on Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM 1575 AM. I am your host Tyler West, a member of the Otago Socialist Society, which just so happens to be the sponsor for this show. Today I'll be joined by fellow Otago Socialist Society member Andrew Tait for a discussion of union affairs in Dunedin as well as some general chat about national and world politics. Andrew is a long-time socialist and unionist who is presently a convener of Union Otago and an organiser or a part-time organiser with Unite Union. How are you going this morning, Andrew?
Good this afternoon, Tyler.
This afternoon, yeah. God damn it.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll be having a chat about all those things. I think a good thing to start off with is, we've had you on before, so probably don't need you to do the big introductory spiel, but just kind of to introduce the topic of the day, which is unions in Otago. Do you want to start off with the most recent Unite action, which you were present for?
Sure. So yesterday was the day when the minimum wage rise was announced. That's a minimum wage rise of 35 cents. That, like the previous wage so-called rise, is actually a cut in terms of inflation. And it concerns everybody that's working on or around the minimum wage. The union that consistently organises people in their sectors affected by that is Unite, which mainly has fast food workers. So a rise in the minimum wage is important for those workers. They're paid above the minimum wage, but not a great deal above. Unite organised a National Day of Action for that, with events, I think, in outside Parliament and in Auckland and stuff like that. Down here in Dunedin, we went for a car convoy. We had a car hekwe. So we decked out our cars and signs and flags and drove from John Wilson Ocean Drive to the university. We did drive-bys on the fast food stores, a loop of the Octagon, just making noise, really. And the good thing about a car is that they make a great deal of noise and take up a lot of space. I was, as a rule, I'm in favour of rallies on the street, but this is quite good for covering the ground and for making a bit of noise. The farmers do it, so why can't fast food workers do it?
Of course. As they say, it's a free country.
It's a free country, yeah. Free speech in a free country.
Yeah.
So it was enjoyable. Talking about free speech, though, we ended up at the at the university building at the clock tower. And the reason why we wanted to go to the clock tower is twofold. One is because it's a iconic Dunedin building, and I really thought it would make a great shot for the newspaper to have fast food workers with their flags and cars and stuff outside of such an iconic building. Secondly, because students are workers and workers are students. So a lot of the fast food workers are or were students, large numbers, and a lot of students at university are also working often in hospitality, often on the minimum wage. So it seemed like an obvious call. There's a big pool of young people there. There's an iconic building. Let's go. However, as we drove into around the front of the clock tower, we got stopped by the deputy proctor. And he said, "Oh, no, you can't come in here." And I was like, "Well, why?" "Oh, there's a sign out the front." I'm like, "But if I was driving here normally, I wouldn't be. I've driven out in front of here often and I haven't been stopped. Why are you stopping us? You're stopping us because it's a protest. It's like, oh, no. It's just, it's noisy and why don't you respect the space? And I'm like, well, taxpayers paid for the university building. I paid for it. I was a past student myself. I didn't say that, but it's an important space for public events, the university. And that is, so far as I know, part of the roading network. I don't know. I mean, possibly it is under university control in one form or another. But it's a grey area, isn't it, really? And we always operate protests in this kind of grey area. The fact that the university wants to assert that kind of control over the grey area is exactly what we expect from corporate universities. They want to control the look, the feel, the environment entirely for a very sedate version of what it is to be a student. So having a protest for the minimum wage doesn't look good. And he said to me, there are no university employees on the minimum wage. We pay the living wage or whatever. After the rally, one of the students that had come to the rally said that, as a matter of fact, she was working at the university on the minimum wage, however, contracted out.
Yes.
So that usual weaseling out of actually paying decent wages by simply contracting it out is prevalent in this environment. So, it was an enjoyable rally. We made a lot of noise, got a nice video up on the ODT that's worth having a look at if you're interested. And good to mark the minimum wage rise. It's April Fool's Day, so we're like, this minimum wage is a joke. It's a bad joke put up by an April Fool, Brooke Van Velden or David Seymour. And I think that we were going for a lively, loud, colourful protest, and we weren't actually looking. It's not a problem for me if the university tries to stop us from going on, because it just highlights for us the way business as usual is prejudicial to the interests of working class people. And having minimum wage workers actually saying, I'm not ashamed of what I do or who I am. I'm angry about what I'm paid. There's a tendency to treat fast food workers as disposable because they work in fast food, and fast food is, you screw up the packaging and throw it away and it's junk food anyway or what have you. But actually, fast food workers provide an important service in our society, and the companies that employ them make massive profits. There's no reason at all why, if you work full-time in a fast food joint, you shouldn't be able to afford a mortgage. You shouldn't be able to afford a house. You shouldn't be on an average wage, not a minimum wage. So that's our attitude, and that's the aim of Unite Union, which it's also worth pointing out is the only union in New Zealand that is a greenfields union since 1991, as in a union established in a sector that had no union in it. And in fact, while there will be other unions around the world that have done the same thing, I don't know of any. So it isn't a big union, but it is a unique union for the way that it's moved into an area where there was nothing and established a small but financially viable and union that punches above its weight in terms of setting the agenda around the rights of minimum wage workers in New Zealand.
And, I mean, from my end, I grew up a little bit after the heyday of Unite back in the 2000s when things were really kicking off, but I've heard plenty of stories about some of the demonstrations that were had back then during the really big campaigns that kind of didn't establish Unite, but really put it on the map in terms of union politics in New Zealand.
Yeah, that's right. So Supersize My Pay was a good example of that. It came out at the same time as a movie, Supersize Me, I think. That was a movie about McDonald's. So it was pretty savvy advertising on the part of Unite. They also had some good Halloween demos with a horror show kind of aesthetic. So fun demos. then, of course, the campaign to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. At the time, I think it was something like 12. And while that campaign wasn't successful, the rise that was achieved was significantly more than what had been going on before that. So we collected 200,000 signatures for raising the minimum wage. And that was, about 100 activists up and down the country. And that's another important thing about Unite, the way they use activists, the way that they're open to activists. And it's something I think that the entire union movement has to get a lot better at. It's service-based unionism hasn't worked. There needs to be a way of tapping into the general frustration that people that are maybe not employed directly in an industry, that are maybe don't even have a union to join at their workplace, a way for those people to actually do the class struggle as well. And Unite's always been very good at that. And if you look around the ranks of union officials in New Zealand, there are a lot that have come through either working for Unite or working on campaigns with Unite. It's been a real nursery for trade union activists.
Yeah, and you need the more of that we have, the better. The more that unions can not only be this body for the betterment of working people, but also a training ground for people to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and act as organizers. The more we have these kind of training grounds, these places where people can cut their teeth getting experience in this kind of politics, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Another important thing about Unite, or another good thing about Unite, is the number of organisers that have come from the shop floor as well, and the members of the executive that have come from the shop floor. So training people to stand on their own 2 feet, that's what the union movement's always about. It's about empowering people to be proud of who they are as working people. After all, we spend the vast majority of our waking lives at work, and if you treat that part of your life as just something which you have to put up with, something that you're not proud of, and you get over, finish as quickly as you can and get on with your hobby, then you're really missing out on a big slice of what it means to, I think, be human.
Absolutely. So that's not the only industrial action that's happened recently. I was wondering if you would be able to talk just a little bit about the recent Apex strikes as well, which have affected the healthcare industry, specifically the blood slabs. And it's an area that I didn't know was as organised as it is.
Yeah. So that's 850 lab technicians that have had, I think, a few strikes now. I think maybe as many as 5 strikes this year, or maybe that was the 5 that were scheduled. But so they're privately owned blood testing companies, or like medical laboratories that employ technicians, scientists, basically, who are a vital part of the health system, because they provide the backroom testing that's necessary for patients in the public system. So it's not as though they're separate from the public system, they're an ancillary part of it. However, they're privately owned, and there's a 30% wage gap between the people working as technicians doing the same job in the private sector as in working for Te Whatu Ora or the health boards. So that's a major gap. So they have problems retaining staff, obviously, but they're also taking money out of the system. So they're taking profits out. These private companies are taking profits out and not passing the profits on to their patients. And that really strikes at the heart of what is the health system for? And I think that when we're thinking about, we're in an environment now where they're talking about public-private partnerships, for instance, there's an assumption that the private sector is playing a supporting role in the health system. And I think that that's something that I disagree with, and it's something that we need to push back against, because while they may be bringing capital to the private sector that the public, or to the public sector, or to the health system that the public sector doesn't have, they're also taking profits out. And there's also that massive question of, well, where does that capital come from in the first place? So we're in a situation in New Zealand right now where we've got government deficits because of tax cuts that then create a situation where we don't have enough money to rebuild the Dunedin hospital, for instance, and therefore we need the private sector to come in. And you can read letters to the newspaper or comments on Facebook where people are saying, oh, thank goodness for the private sector, they're going to come to the rescue, ignoring the fact that a lot of that money that could have been taken in tax would have avoided the need to go to the private sector in the first place. And then once you had the private sector involved in your public health system, they've basically got a stent, like they've got a drip plugged into your arm that they can just siphon blood out of the system continually. And I think that we need to make a distinction when we're talking about these partnerships between not-for-profits and for-profits. So there are some not-for-profits in the health sector. There's good examples in the education sector, the kindergartens and kohanga reo, for instance. These are not-for-profits that are funded by the government. And in the case of kohanga reo, unfortunately paid well below for their staff. But that's a different thing from ABC Childcare, for instance. Well, ABC I don't think functions in this country, but Best Start and other childcare centres, which are exporting money from New Zealand to their parent companies in profits and paying lousy wages in early childhood as well. So a similar situation with these labs. I think that 30% pay gap needs to be probably fixed in the long run by nationalising the labs. And the same thing would apply to the same thing does apply to GPs in Britain, for instance, in the NHS system. When the National Health System was set up, GPs were included in that. Now, we don't think of GPs as part of the private system so much because they're local. They're called, public health, primary health organisations. They're funded largely by the government, but they're also businesses. And being businesses, in some cases that works for the GPs, in some cases it doesn't work for the GPs. And it is that unpredictable market situation that exists for primary care in New Zealand that also delivers less than transparent results and chaotic results. So I think that the experience of healthcare, we've got half a century of it, more than half a century of mass public health, and it's obvious that the way to run it is through public provision, not through private health provision.
Yeah, and it's good that you bring up the hospital because that's such the pressing issue for Dunedin at the moment. It's the big topic of discussion. It's the big thing that everyone has an opinion on. And the thing is, it's also a national problem because it is one of the main hospitals across the country. It services two entire provinces, as well as being available to take the excess of something, say an earthquake damages, say Christchurch is another earthquake and it damages Christchurch earthquake, then where a patient's going to be sent, well, one of the places is going to be Dunedin Hospital. And it is one of those things where it's very difficult to make excuses with the hospital because the effects of it not being built to adequate standards, not being built to accommodate a growing population, the problems that arise if those don't happen are very obvious for anyone to see. It's very difficult to kind of put that back in the box, so to speak, now that it has been raised and the hospital is being built. You can't go, well, we can cut this and that, but pretty much anyone you talk to is going to recognize that population has grown, more people are going to need medical services because there's simply more people. And to accommodate that, there needs to be a larger hospital, and not only a larger hospital, but a hospital that improves on the equipment and safety standards of the current hospital, which is something that you can have the best trained and the most dedicated hospital staff of all categories, but if their equipment doesn't work, if the rooms that they are doing surgeries in, if the rooms that they're having patients stay in while they're there, etc., even just the records room, if any of that is going to be run down, then there's nothing that the staff can really do about that except put a very small band-aid on a very big wound. And it's also the case that the hospital system in New Zealand stands as a pretty damn good example of where things go if you have a public entity, a public industry that can't really be fully privatized. Or if you try and fully privatize it, you kind of get what happened back in the 90s, which is you have entire, not big hospitals, but the small hospitals just closing their doors, which is obviously something that absolutely no one wants. I think even a lot of the people who stood to immediately benefit from them could probably, if you really prodded them, see the very immediate short to long-term downsides of a hospital closing its doors. Unfortunately for them, workers do need to reproduce themselves in order to continue working, and it's kind of difficult to do that if you can't get adequate medical care.
Yeah, and on the health sector, I think that you referred to the 1990s. I would just remind listeners that in the 1990s, hospital boards were turned into Crown Health enterprises that were supposed to compete with each other. So you had publicly funded entities competing on a fake market model that really just led to loads of cuts to services. And that was the aim of it. Again, the government had cut taxes, had laid off people from work, so they're paying more and more overall in terms of social support, social welfare, because the unemployment had gone through the roof. So it was the government in a self-created financial crisis that was then degrading our expectations of an improvement in healthcare. And improvements in healthcare are one of the things that really make the 20th century remarkable. So especially the second half of the 20th century, this idea that we're living in a world that progresses, where things are better for us than for our parents, and they'll be better for our children. The 1990s are the beginning of eroding that. And I think that that's what they're trying to set up now with this new hospital, to downgrade our expectations from having something equivalent to what was built. When was it built? In the 1960s, the existing hospital?
I believe it was built then. I think as it exists today, it's, I think the last of it was completed in the 80s, I want to say.
Okay, 1980s, yeah. So yeah, there's that expectation. So to downgrade our expectations, and what you were saying about population growth is really important too. So it's not just about wanting something better because it's more modern and we're living in an era with massive increases in technology. And there's no reason why we shouldn't expect something better in this era of massively increased technology. But we just want our hospital, our health service, to keep up with the population growth that's already taken place. And Craig Rennie, who's the CTU economist, makes the point that actually we're not saying that the Dunedin hospital should be the only one to be built. We're actually saying Auckland needs 2 new hospitals, complete new hospitals, just to reflect population growth. Just to reflect population growth. So if you are not building hospitals and your population is growing, then the healthcare being offered is declining. I'd also want to you were talking about the way that rural hospitals, for instance, shut down. They didn't just shut down. Some were taken over and run as by local semi-private trusts. So in Central Otago and Oamaru, I think, are the closest ones here. And these trust hospitals are a strange beast in that they're completely almost entirely dependent on government funding. However, the buildings to a certain extent are the responsibility of the trusts. So there's an ability there for the government to have two-tier funding to a certain extent, where people living in rural areas that are not so wealthy are going to get worse care, and then people living in wealthy areas potentially can get top-ups to their care to what they're paying. I'd also just flag the issue of the charity hospitals. There's a charity hospital that's been opened in Southland, and there's a couple of Christian type medical centres or hospitals here, Mercy Hospital being the most obvious one. Mercy Hospital really functions to provide a way for people with private health insurance to jump the queue in the private sector. So the idea that Christian hospitals are there to provide care to those who are unable to afford it is out of date. So maybe that was the case in the Middle Ages when monasteries provided care. But in this environment, it's the public health system. That's the universal system. That's the way to actually deliver care to the most people who need it the most efficiently. And these charity hospitals, these medical centres, these private hospitals, private religious-owned hospitals, are actually white-anting and undermining the public health system. And I think that has to be said really clearly, because churches will always come out, from a statement from the councils of bishops or what have you, bemoaning the state of investment in public infrastructure like health. But then meanwhile, religious orders or religious organisations are owning private sector operations that are effectively undermining the health system. A controversial point maybe, but I think it's worth bearing in mind.
Well, it's also, you can make that point without making really any kind of statement about even religion itself, because what you're saying is that there needs to be, it's a disagreement as to how the system is run. It's not a disagreement based on the religious practices therein, or a statement for that matter on the efficacy of the people that actually work there. I'm certain that I've never had been treated at Mercy Hospital. I've been treated at one of its outpatient clinics, but not at the main hospital itself. But I don't know anyone who's had an issue with the actual treatment there. It's a matter of how is the overall health system run, and how is it best run in the interests of public health.
Yes. And then there's also the issue that we probably won't get into now because it's another can of worms, but there is a medical centre that's almost finished right nearby where the new hospital is going to be, and that medical centre is at least part owned by Kaitahu, as well as Te Kaik, which is largely government-funded, privately owned, iwi-owned medical centre in South Dunedin. These are all complicated. It's a complicated ecosystem. But I think that despite the complications, as I said earlier, it's pretty clear from international studies that universal public health is the cheapest way to deliver effective public health, and that should be our lodestar. So we fully support the Apex workers who are working again in private sector. So we do want them to be well paid. We want those jobs to be working, but we're recognising that 30% pay gap between private and public is probably not going to go anywhere so long as there's private companies that are taking a profit out of it. In terms of the hospital, though, to segue onto the International Workers' Memorial Day event, so this is our next event on the calendar for the local affiliates council of the trade unions in Dunedin. International Workers' Memorial Day is an event that's held on the 28th of April every year. Manor Place is there's a memorial down there that's next to the bus hub the bus depot down Princes Street. And there's a memorial there, and every year we remember in a fairly somber ceremony, because it is a memorial service for people who've died at work. So we remember those who have died at work. And this year we're going to be thinking about two aspects to this issue, and one is the hospital itself, and the other is construction, because construction is obviously the hospital's getting built right now. So the construction, we have a massive construction site in the middle of the city. And the other is thinking about not just people that are injured at work, but then what kind of care do they get afterwards? Can they rehabilitate? What kind of life do they have afterwards? And then, even premature death, so it may not be a workplace injury but not having access to health care will disproportionately impact people without private insurance. And you and I both know Cedric Broughton, Taneroa, who died today, in fact, last year. And, so he's a good friend of ours and a keen supporter of trade unions, who died relatively young of cancer. And that's highly relevant to that debate that was taking place about Māori and Pacifica access to bowel screening, because that's the kind of thing that takes people out, well before he had a chance to retire. So he's worked all of his life, paid taxes, and now, worked all of his life that he could have not avoided, paid taxes, and but won't be enjoying a retirement. And every worker that dies prematurely because of not having access to proper screening and misses out on that retirement, that's a broken social contract.
And it's you I think a lot of people think of the long-term deaths as a result of work that aren't necessarily from injuries. They often think of things that have happened in the past and have been addressed, but it's not the case at all that this is something that is relegated to the past. It's very easy to point to something from the past, say the widespread use of asbestos and the effect that had on anyone working in construction or any kind of renovation.
Yep.
That's still a present risk, because there are still plenty of buildings that were built in that era when asbestos was standard, and it's not always the case that the proper safety gear that is needed to deal with the presence of asbestos is always used. I don't know off the top of my head, but I would not be surprised if there are ongoing, to this day, deaths that are premature that are associated with, for example, asbestos. And the same is true of a lot of other construction materials and a lot of other materials used in the production of an enormous number of goods.
Well, I haven't studied this area, so I'm happy to be corrected by any listener that knows better. But I do know people that have worked in asbestos removal, and I think that, so this is anecdotal, make of it what you want, but asbestos removal is usually reasonably well paid, but very short-term, casualised, contracted out, with the kind of workforce that is say Taneroa was working in asbestos removal at one stage as well. So a workforce that is peripheral, so not permanent, full-time, with solid, secure jobs where the company, if anybody gets asbestosis, is going to have to look after them. These people are in, they do a month or maybe 2 months, maybe longer, but they're gangs that get formed for a project and then disbanded, often using labour hire companies and stuff like that. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Hey, this concern about asbestos and then the way that the removal of it was organised because of the nature of New Zealand's casualised workforce. It was always going to be the most casual workers that were going to be dealing with the dirtiest jobs. The other thing is silicosis. So while we have an awareness of asbestos now, there's manufactured stone that has become an issue in Australia, and thank goodness for the Construction Workers Union in Australia being proactive about this, because we don't have a construction union, and the only reason why we're even talking about silicosis is because of that union there. And I would wonder also about what is going to be the long-term impacts of all of the plastic and silicon and petrochemical-based products that are used in building now. So we talk about lead being obviously bad, and yes, we know that lead is bad, but it was replaced in many cases by petroleum-based products in construction, which actually have a shorter lifespan than lead in terms of their breakdown. So what are going to be the environmental impacts of these products once they start breaking down en masse? And that's just the nature of the system, and that basically you have one problem and then you solve it with like three other things that will cause three new problems, because it's all about profit. And also, I mean, it's always worth remembering Pike River.
Yes, absolutely.
That's an enormous disaster. 30 people killed at work, and always worth remembering also the CTV building in Christchurch, where like I can't remember how many died there, but it was considerable.
Yeah, and these are they're the recent ones. I would also add to that the firefighters who were killed during Cyclone Gabrielle.
Yeah,
those are absolutely deaths at work, and they should absolutely be counted as such, even if it is a line of work that's extraordinarily dangerous.
Yeah,
but those are still deaths at work. The two men who died during Cyclone Gabrielle, and I forget where exactly they were, but 2 deaths at a single call out. That is still the deadliest, and it's happened before, but it's never been more than 2 deaths at once.
Yeah,
that remains the deadliest day for the fire service, and it cuts deep. It cuts very deep.
Yeah. Yeah. So in New Zealand at work, there's about like 1 or 2 people every week that are killed, and pretty much 1 person every day is badly maimed. So that's significant, and it's much higher than Australia. I think it's in construction double Australia and 4 times the rate in the UK. So yeah, no, it is it's an ongoing issue, and getting like having an excellent healthcare system that's freely available to everybody, it's a wonderful thing, you know. And I think that everybody who has been, the unfortunate thing is that you can often not get care for small, low-level problems or chronic problems. But if it's acute, then I have lots of people that have had excellent experiences with the health system, and it really is such an amazing support, and such a concrete expression of the care and respect that we have for each other, no matter who we are. And I think that it's wonderful, and I'm really proud of everybody working in that system, and keeping it running for us. It's excellent work.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're getting to the end of the episode, but there is one other thing that I'd like to get to, and that is the upcoming CTU actions, I should say, not just here in Dunedin, actions around the country. Would you like to speak a little bit to that, because that is happening just a few days after Workers' Memorial Day on the 28th?
Yeah, that's right. So 2 days later, there's at the Museum Reserve, there's going to be a CTU event. That's every union that's affiliated with the CTU has been invited to call a stop work meeting. A stop work meeting is a paid meeting. Every union member gets 4 hours paid meetings a year, and this will be a 2-hour meeting. It's paid. That means that members should turn up. They're supposed to turn up. Last year we had about 400, 500 people in the Octagon. this year we're going to the Museum Reserve. It's a way of amplifying our voice by focusing on what we have in common as union members, whether that's working in bus drivers or lecturers, nurses, whatever. So that's Museum Reserve on May the 1st at 12 p.m. Yeah.
And I imagine the focus of that will also touch on what we've been discussing, the healthcare system as well.
Yes, that's right. I mean, in Dunedin, the hospital's massive, and around the country, healthcare is a major issue. As I said before, we wouldn't have this problem if it weren't for the tax cuts. This is a manufactured crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm. All right. Well, we are getting to the end of the show, and as is always the case for the latter end of the show, I finish things off with some reviews / recommendations of some media. It's just a way to kind of both celebrate the artistic and also just a way to kind of lighten things up in case an episode happens to be particularly heavy, which occasionally it is. Unfortunately, all in the world of politics is usually not all that friendly or bright. Anyway, I was wondering if Andrew, if you would like to open things off. I know you've got a book that you've recently read, and I was wondering if you would want to start things off just by telling us a little bit about that book.
Sure. I've been reading Twilight Children by Siddhartha Deb. That's a book about India, about the rise to power of Narendra Modi. He is a far right. He's from a far right background, a Hindu nationalist background. He was a member of the organisation, a member of which assassinated Gandhi. So in many ways, it's sort of part of it's a far right movement. It's interesting because Luxon's just been to India. A lot of people in New Zealand have seen the way that China is no longer flavour of the month because of the fallout between the United States and China. So we feel worried about being exposed in terms of our number one trade partner being China. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are saying India is the new China. I think it is not. And partly, and it's not because China is left-wing and India is right-wing, not at all. I think that one's state capitalist system, China, and the other is like a free market capitalist system. But I don't think that, I think the economic success of Modi is really overrated. And I think that his politics, his far-right politics, are immensely dangerous and really chaotic. He came to power on the back of pogroms against Muslims in his home state, Gujarat. His popularity has been closely tied to violence. And this is not a model for stability. India is struggling economically in all sorts of indicators. And while there are areas of immense profits, and there's a huge wealth among the upper echelons of Indian society, the infrastructure, the human development of India is still pretty abysmal. And it is pretty desperate to think about the situation of many people that are in lower castes in this situation where you have a Hindu extremist organization coming to power. It's kind of like if you think about, and it's not a great analogy, but if you think about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, the former slave owners coming to power in the South, and their views on color, like there's the BJP, Modi's party, believe that they are kicking back against the lower castes who've been getting unfair advantages through affirmative action, etc., and they want to push them back into their place. And that is, it's an interesting book, well worth reading. And I wanted to digress about Trump and the rise of police state fascism there. I think that it is worth saying that Trump is taking a lot of tips from Modi's playbook, and I think that in the case of the role of the police in taking people off the street in the United States, I think that that does make me feel uncomfortable about the role of the police in New Zealand. I know it's not the same country, but I just wanted to also squeeze Tamitha Paul in there and say, what the hell, Chris Hipkins? What the hell? You know? Like, police are always used to break strikes. And the only reason why you could have a Labour Party Prime Minister get away with that is that there have been so few strikes in the last 30 years. Like, that's basically his sucking up to the police is anathema to the mainstream of the Labour movement. Police are to be tolerated at best.
Yeah, and it's difficult for it's difficult to look at New Zealand history and say that our police have been comparatively benign. We haven't had the extreme degree of violence that the police have conducted in some countries, but that does not mean by any measure that there haven't been any number of very egregious abuses of police power across New Zealand history, right back to 1913. Just to pick a number out of the hat, 1913, over 100 years ago, you would find police being the ones that are on the other side of the barricade, so to speak.
Absolutely, yeah. And 1981, of course.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, which is also relevant in that was, like the police in that case did see themselves as part of like defending like the fraternity that existed between South Africa and New Zealand. And so South African apartheid and South African apartheid policing definitely bled over into the pro-Tour support, especially in Red Squad and White Squad, which were fascistic type organisations. So, yeah, police are prone to that kind of a thing. And then, of course, plays like the Oruera raids, when they went absolutely batshit crazy, finding terrorists in the bush in Tuhoi and like anarchists in Wellington. And then, what the hell, like Brenton Tarrant shoots 51 people in Christchurch. Yeah.
Yeah. And conducted that attack in an atmosphere where, in an intelligence atmosphere where there had been warning after warning after warning that something like that could happen.
Yes.
Yes. But we are.
So Tamitha is not off. I don't think that she's crazy at all. No. She's speaking a truth that Hipkins doesn't want to hear. Yeah.
Appealing to a centre that don't want him.
yeah, that's right.
As is always the case.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're getting to the last few minutes, so I'll get through my reviews before we close things out. First off, I have brought, of course, as is always the case, one piece of New Zealand media, one piece of just a free slot that I can put anything I want in there. Let's start with the New Zealand media, just because it's on topic. I actually picked the fantastic 1983 documentary Patu today, which is one of my favourite pieces of New Zealand filmmaking of any kind, one of the most impactful documentaries I've ever watched. I'm blanking on the name.
The Great Marato Mita.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. I was blanking on the name right when I was going to say it. Yeah, just one of New Zealand's most interesting filmmakers. And for anyone who has a family connection to what happened in 1981, and that is the vast majority of people in New Zealand will have some kind of familial connection, a family friend with a connection. It's still not that long ago, even though it's over 40 years. It's close enough that my mum was, she was a teenager at the time, and she was on the Dunedin demonstrations.
Awesome.
But if you want to get a very skillfully told and on-the-ground eye story of 1981 and the tour and the reaction against it, if you want to get just a feel for what it was like at the time, then I probably can't recommend anything other, at least in terms of film, I can't recommend anything other than Tait. Once again, that came out in 1983, and I believe New Zealand On Screen has
Free.
it. You can just watch it there for free. It's also reasonably easy to find elsewhere, but that I think is pretty much the easiest because you can just watch it on their website. The free slot, I've picked a punk album that I've been listening to quite a bit recently. That is the 2003 sophomore album Exit English by the melodic hardcore band Strike Anywhere. Strike Anywhere, I don't know if they were ever, it's slightly before my time, if they ever got particularly big in New Zealand, but in the kind of late 90s, 2000s anti-globalization, anti-war scene in the US, they were a really big name. They were a very good band. I really enjoy their music, not only for its highly charged political content, I also just think they're pretty goddamn good, and that's always the mix that you want to hear. They are definitely on the more melodic end of hardcore, so it's something that's probably a little bit easier to listen to if you're coming at it from someone who's not particularly interested in punk, or you just haven't really ever given punk that much of a chance. It's definitely something where you can
help your mum get over Coldplay.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's more on that end of things than it is, it's not as comparable to the more hectic and kind of raw end of hardcore that you can find elsewhere if you so are interested. Exit English in particular, not talking about the band but the album itself, I think is their best album. It really, being from 2003, it really speaks to the fury at the time. It came out pretty much, I believe, right after or right before the invasion of Iraq started, and the politics of the day. These guys come from kind of a anarchistish or anarchist-adjacent background, as was fairly common in the scene at the time. The politics of the day are there for all to listen to. There are songs about police violence, about stopping the war, about consumerism and the way it dehumanizes people. If you are interested in an album that has a really pressing political message that has not lost any of its urgency over time, and has this kind of energy that I think even the band themselves had trouble kind of replicating with later releases, even though I like most of what they released afterward, then this is absolutely an album for you. So once again, those two were Tait, documentary from 1983, which is available on New Zealand On Screen, and the album, sophomore album, Exit English from 2003 by the band Strike Anywhere. Once again, just before we get to signing off, you are listening to Otago Access Radio 105.3 FM, 1575 AM. And this show is sponsored by the Otago Socialist Society, to which I happen to be a member, and to which my guest also happens to be a member. And I just want to throw one last thanks to Andrew for coming in today.
Kia ora. Thank you very much for your work. Thanks. Thank you, listeners.
Absolutely. Without the listeners, this show is simply me talking into thin air. We will be back, or I will be back at least in a month's time, part of our full weekly schedule. And I'm hoping that the next one will be a pretty good episode, not teasing who's going to be coming on, but I am quite happy with this one. We'll just say that much. Anyway, we are signing out here once again, left from nowhere, Otago Access Radio, Otago Socialist Society, and we'll leave it at that. 105.4 FM.
It's on a big sign behind him.
The white sucks stronger by the year. The white sucks stronger by the year. The white sucks stronger by the year. The answer's never clear. You walk upon the sphere.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.